Well, good morning, viewers. Today we have a 2010 Subaru Forester, and the history is that the engine was replaced because of an oil leak, probably at the head gaskets, but it was replaced with a Japanese motor, a JDM, not exactly the same year, maybe 1 year older, with low mileage. And ever since that time, it has difficulty starting cold. So I had the customer drop it off yesterday and left it overnight for a cold soak. It's about -7 this morning, Celsius, whatever that is in Fahrenheit for you Americans. We're gonna scan it for codes first of all. I'll get set up here. Should auto ID. Subaru, where's Subaru? Automatic ID, newer, 2007 and newer. And I don't know what the mileage is on it. VIN 6 or VIN 6 is not a turbo. How could they both have VIN 6 and be a turbo and non-turbo? So we're going to do a network scan, or I'm just going to go into the engine and scan it for codes and see if there's any codes related to the engine. Check engine light has not been reported to be on. Codes. And manufacturer specific codes. Current codes. No current codes. Let's see if there's any history codes. It's had a new battery installed and plugs replaced since the engine. And so that's not going to help us. Let's look at generic codes in case there's something on the generic side. No codes. So no code help whatsoever. So let's look at data. We're concerned about barometric pressure, temperatures, engine data, misfire data, fuel control data. Let's just try the engine data list first off. Well, coolant temperature is -6. Let's see if there's any other temperatures readings here. I'm going to look around. So I built a custom data list, but then when I go to actually look at the custom data list, it pulls up the entire list and it seems to double up some of the data parameters. But I see the coolant temperature at -6, atmospheric pressure at 28.9, which is realistic. Camshaft signal, crankshaft signal, the check engine light is on. I did not hear the fuel pump prime, but I'm not sure if this one does that. Fuel injector pulse width, we're going to graph that. Come on, you can do it. And engine RPM, engine speed, we're going to graph that as well. Coolant temperature, where's air temperature? Coolant temperature, see it's repeated several times. Engine speed. Intake air is +2, that's a little high. But I don't know if that's enough to cause a crank no start condition. It's definitely not +2, it's been sitting all night. Let's look at the mass airflow sensor, grams per second. And then airflow and as a voltage. Let's see what it does cranking. Well, that's not very... Started perfectly. Not very conclusive. Well, I'm going to have to talk with the customer and ask to keep it for another night. They said if it was below freezing there was a problem, but maybe it's warm enough today. not to act up. As you could hear, it started perfectly fine. Well, I'm going to save this recording. So we're back working on this Subaru Forester this morning. Going to rescan it. It isn't that cold today. It's only like -5 or -6. And I'm wondering if the intake air temp sensor is part of the math. And of course, by the time I get the key on and read the temperature, the MAF sensor may warm up and make the intake air temperature sensor reading a little higher than real. -4. Well, let's see how it starts this morning. A little longer than normal crank, but it wasn't that bad. I wonder if it's losing fuel pressure. But normally, let's see if it's got a fuel pump prime. Yeah, it does. Well, I guess we could put a fuel pressure gauge on it and see how fast the fuel pressure comes up when it's starting, but that wasn't a bad start event. Well, I'll have to talk with this customer. So this morning it's -18. We're back working on this 2010 Subaru Forester. We're going to see if it'll start this morning. Going to look at the check engine light. It's freaking cold in here. Scan some data. Let's turn it off one more time and see if... No, I don't want to do that. Record the temperatures during cranking, injector pulse width. The last 3 days it's been fairly mild and it's been starting, although the last time it was a little longer than I would have appreciated for cranking. I'm not going to build a custom data list. Temperature -19, intake air -19, engine speed, let's see if we get injector pulse width. Come on, Snap-on, we need a keyword search for the data parameters. There's too many data parameters. Ignition timing, crankshaft position signal, let's look at that. Injector driver relay. .8 volts. Well, I don't see it. I'm going to try it. So let's see what happens. Fuel pump's running in the tank. I can hear it. Gonna give it a little air. All right, well, we need to check fuel pressure. Let's save this recording. Turn the key off and we're going to go in and analyze the data. So I'm going to view the data here, see if I see if we were getting an injector pulse width. We had a cam and crank signals. So both atmospheric pressure was 28.9 and map sensor reading was 28.9. Where's the map sensor? We got airflow. We got mass airflow sensor reading in grams per second. So we're definitely getting airflow. Let's bring up 16 graphs. Fuel pump relay was on. Let's go down the list here. Fuel injection pulse width milliseconds. There it is there. So we got injector pulse width. We got engine RPM. We got airflow, we got a map sensor reading, ignition timing, commanding the ignition, battery voltage is kind of low, but it's a new battery. But it is minus 19 this morning. It's been sitting for a couple of days. Throttle motor duty cycle is there. Crank signal is there. So it's got to be fuel related. Now they did say they had a different engine replaced, and I wonder if it's got the same injectors for North America versus Japan. I think this is a Japanese engine. So I'm going to have to do some research to find out, but I think I'm going to try and start it with some propane and see if it'll start. So I've got a propane bottle here with a small propane heating tip plumbed into the PCV fresh air intake into the air induction system, and I'm going to try cranking it and adding propane while it's cranking. Now I can't videotape this. Let's try it like this. Here we go. That didn't work. As you can hear, that didn't work. So I tried introducing the propane here as well, and that didn't help. So now I'm not sure if we got spark. I'm gonna have to check for spark on this thing. And we're gonna have to get some help to push it in the shop. So I got a spark plug wire or a jumper wire connected to one of the coils. The other spark plug wire is still attached to the companion cylinder, and I've got about a 1/2 inch air gap set there. We're gonna see if we got spark. I didn't hear any spark. You're gonna have to watch this video and see if we have spark. So I reviewed the video and I didn't see any spark. I didn't hear anything either. Usually you'd hear a snap from the coil. I reduced the air gap to about 1/4 inch. Let's try it now. Well, that's interesting. Let me look at this video again. Well, this is an interesting case. It appears that we have no spark, yet we had the ignition injector pulse according to the scan tool. It's not convenient to get to the control side of this coil. And it looks like the coil's been replaced. I know the plugs and plug wires have been replaced, but it looks almost like that coil might have been replaced. Yet there's no spark on that spark plug wire. The other spark plug wire is still attached to the engine, so it should have fired. It's a way spark system. I really need to check the control side of the coil to see if we're getting a pulse on there. And then we also have the injectors. I got to get a trouble light out here now. It's starting to get dark. So the control side of the coil is way down inside there, and I can't get at it very conveniently. It looks like the connector's plugged in. Maybe if I move these plug wires out of the way. I wonder if I should get a heat gun and heat this coil up and see if it'll... Because the customer reports that if they plug the car in, it starts and runs. And it only happens if it's below -10. I can maybe unplug that ignition coil and check for a trigger signal. I got to look at the schematic and see how it works. So here's the component guided testing in the snap-on tool here, and it says that the ICM and coil are integrated together. Now, as far as I could tell, there was only 3 wires on that coil. This one shows 4. Mind you, this is a VIN G, and the VIN in this vehicle, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, is a C as in Charlie. So I'm not 100% certain that this is correct. This is showing that it's got transistors in the coils, in the coil pack. I'm going to look some more. So here's an OEM diagram, and it shows the ignition coil igniter assembly with 4 wires to it. And usually when it says igniter assembly, it contains transistors. But I'm not completely convinced. I'm still looking. So the coil does in fact have 4 wires to it. So the 2 middle wires are ignition, power, and ground. And I've got a headlight connected across it. So I'm going to see if we have power to the ignition coil and ground at the same time, obviously. Turning the key on now. And the wipers, obviously. Let's see if it's power cranking. Yeah. Okay, so we're going to have to scope that control signal. How come that didn't shut off? Why didn't the coil shut off? Got the key out of the ignition. That's strange. Why would it keep power on there all the time? Got the key out of the ignition. Huh. That's an odd one. No dash lights on. Well, the key is on the seat. No dash lights on, yet there's power to the coil. Power and ground. I wonder where that comes from. That is strange. Is that related to my problem? So here's a picture of the connector and the 2 middle pins. Pin 2 is power, it's red and green. Pin 3 is ground. Pin 1 is cylinder 3-4, and pin 4 is cylinder 1-2. So I imagine it would be a 5-volt pulse, because that's usually what the ECM does to it. Yeah, it's just a 5-volt pulse. I would imagine it's 5 volts. But I can't explain why that headlight is remaining on. But I'm not going to overly stress it like that just yet. I'm going to see if we've got ignition control pulses with a lab scope. So I got the lab scope, 2-channel lab scope connected to both 5-volt pulses that should be triggering the coil. When I came back outside, the headlight was out. So I'm going to go inside the car and crank it. Interestingly, that headlight came back on again. So we have pulses, but no spark, so. Or did we have pulses? I'm backing up in the waveform. Yeah, there it is. So we definitely got pulses. Yeah, definitely got pulses. Beautiful. Well, I'm going to call the ignition coil. That's weird that ignition power stays on. I got the key off and it stays on for quite a while. I've never seen a coil fail like that. I wonder if we heat up that coil with a heat gun, if it'll start working. I'm going to try that. Why not? At least to get it in the shop. We got the coil plugged back in, plug wire back on, and I'm heating it up with a heat gun. Get it nice and warm. See if it starts working again. I don't want to get it too hot, melt it. I've seen electronics fail when they're hot and cold and such, but not recently. Mind you, this engine came from Japan, and if I came from Japan to Northern Ontario, I wouldn't want to go either. Well, let's see what'll happen now. If that was the problem, and I would expect this thing to be flooded because the injectors should have been delivering fuel. Let's see what happens. It's definitely acting like it's got no spark. I wonder if I can get out a plug wire here on this side. Down here. Okay, I'm going to check for spark at this spark plug on this left bank. Well, I'm definitely not hearing spark. I'm going to check that recording. So no spark at about 30,000 volts. So I adjusted it down to about 2,000 volts, about 1/8 of an inch. We'll see if we got weak spark. I'm going to call that ignition coil. Well, I'm going to order up an ignition coil, but I plugged in the block heater to see if it'll start tomorrow after it's being plugged in, because that's what the customer says they have to do to get it to start. You would think if it was the coil warming it up would make a difference, but maybe it's not quite warm enough. It is -20 out here, and I'm frozen. So we're going to put this coil on this Subaru this morning, but it's been sitting outside all night with the battery or with the block heater plugged in, and it's actually warmed up. It's actually -7 or 8 Celsius today, so we're going to see if it'll start and I can drive it in. So let's see if this thing will start. It's actually melted the snow off the hood in places. Let's see. Can you imagine that? Well, at least I can drive it in the shop now. So there are 3 fasteners on this coil. Take note of where the spark plugs go. Number 1 is this 1 and 3, 1, 3, and the other side is 2, 4. So 1 and 2 are companion cylinders. trying to get the bolts out. There's the old coil off. It's hard to tell whether this has been replaced. I don't see any labeling on it anywhere. Looks exactly like the new one. Now we'll put some dielectric grease in the spark plug boots and put it back on. So there it is, back together and running. I see they put a shorter belt on here. Must be that the AC doesn't work, or it's seized or something. No, it's not seized. No, that's secondary. I don't think it needs AC right now. So now we got to park it outside and hope it cools off tonight. See how it starts tomorrow. I'm going to do a network code scan. See what kind of codes we generated by unplugging that ignition coil yesterday. Look at that, no codes in it. That's pretty crappy. Completely disconnected ignition coil and cranking it for 20 minutes and no codes. Oh well. I guess I didn't have to worry about clearing codes out of it. I would have expected to have a ignition coil control code like P0350, 152, power supply the voltage low. Liquid dynamics control interrupt because of engine instruction. Yet the ECM has no codes in it. Unless it's a pending code, because these might be current codes. No. Well, let's go into the ABS. And clear the codes out of there for now. Then we're going to park this thing outside and let it cool off, and hopefully it starts properly tomorrow. Engine off. Eon engine off. Well, it's the next morning. This is going to be a true test. It's minus 25 Celsius this morning. Car's been sitting since yesterday morning when I changed the coil. Let's see if this thing will start. Obviously not. So what am I missing? Well, we're going to check and see if we got spark. Well, we're going to crank it and see if we have spark now. I gotta replay this. Well, that's special. It's got no spark, yet we had a RPM signal and injector command. I wonder if it's got an injector pulse though. I'm trying to see if I can get at one of the injectors to put a noid light on it, but they're buried in here. There's a heat shield in the way. And the intake manifold's in the way. Oh my goodness. Well, the injectors are nearly impossible to get to. How could plugging it in and warming it up make it start? I had an ignition trigger, I had power and ground to the coil. Got no spark, but I need to know if we got injector pulse. The scan tool showed injector activity. It showed RPM and a crank signal and a cam signal. Where are the damn injectors? I gotta get a trouble light out here. So I'm looking at case histories on Identifix, and it's not a common complaint, hard start cold, but here's one that says hard start, long crank time, there's no spark or injector pulse initially. But we had ignition coil trigger events. I don't get it. I can't get at the injectors. There's a shield in front of the way, and you'd have to take a bunch of bolts out of it. The two top bolts are accessible, but the ones at the front and the bottom are not. At least not outside in minus 25 weather. So I plugged it in. Gonna warm it up and see if it'll start. It cranks fast enough, in my opinion. It should start. I wonder if this is a magnetic pulse generator. I'm gonna get it warmed up and get it in the shop and put some test probes on it so that I can check for injector pulse. And we know that there's no spark from the coil, and it's a new coil, and I can't see a new coil being exactly the same as the old one. Here's one. Test for injector pulse. If missing, just spark. Test for power to the ignition coil. Well, we've confirmed power and ground to the ignition coil. It ran a headlight even during cranking when it had no spark the other day. But another thing that kind of bothers me is when it did start yesterday morning, after being plugged in all night, it wasn't really flooded, mind you. It had all night for the fuel vapor to escape to the atmosphere. It wouldn't have been, if it was delivering fuel through the injectors and it was just a simple lack of spark, I would expect it to be flooded. Oh well, we got to get it running, get it in the shop, get some test wires on it. So I'm looking at the wiring diagram, and here's the 4 injectors. Obviously testing with a Noid light right at the injector would be desirable, but there's another connector, E2B21. I think that's the one. It's a bulkhead connector or a latch connector on the right rear corner of the engine for when you disassemble the engine. Power through there, pin 48, and the injector control wires are pin 42, 43, 44, 45. That's convenient. I'm going to print this diagram and see if we can access that connector and back in these pins, or one of these pins. So we're going to see if this Subaru will start so I can get it in the shop and put some test probes on it. It's been plugged in for several hours now. It was acting like it was flooded. Well, let's get it in the shop. So it did smell like raw fuel when I fired it up just now, but that's the connector I'm going to try to do some testing at, because the injectors are down underneath this plate. I tried to take this plate off here. There's 2 bolts here, and a bolt down there, and a bolt down here, and a couple on the bottom. So that's not convenient. So everything runs through that latched connector there, so I should be able to identify and backpin an injector wire. So the wires in question are pins 42, 43, 44, and 45 at that connector. Here's a picture of it here. So it's the 3rd row, or it's the middle row of larger terminals. Let's have a look at the connector. So there it is there, unlatched. So that should be 42, 43, 44, 45. I'll just double check the wire colors. Now, you would think warming up the engine would have no effect on the ECM, because the ECM lives underneath the passenger floor mat. You can see the wiring harness going inside here, goes into the cab through this big grommet. So we're gonna, let's see, is one of those wires pink and looks like blue and red? Pink, blue, and red. Let's have a look. Decided to take the coil off and put a jumper, 4 jumper wires in across the coil, and check pin 1, which is the green wire. And I think I may have found something of concern when I was inserting the probes in there. Pin 1, or pin 2 and 3 are the power and ground. I'll show you what I mean. So I was trying to put a T-harness in place, and I've got the proper size terminal here, and this one here seems very loose. Both of these seem very loose. Not much pin drag there. They're actually narrower than this pin.
this pin doesn't fit in here. And they're not as small as the smaller ones. So I'm using this FLT2-3. I wonder if that's all it is a poor pin drag. Well, I'm going to try and fix that. So the blue plastic secondary lock just pops out of there, and the terminals are oriented green with a black tracer, red, white, that's either yellow or beige, and brown, looking at it from the top. So I'm going to de-pin all these terminals and reshape them. So to release these terminals, you need a little tool to reach down here and pry this plastic apart and pull out on the wire at the same time. So those terminals are pretty tiny. I wonder if I can buy this pigtail. Well, I'm going to reshape all these terminals. So I managed to reshape the terminals by inserting a pick from the back and twisting it to increase the pin drag. That's got a good drag now. That's got a good drag. That's got a good drag. Now we got to put the terminals back into the appropriate spots. Not much room here. You know, the brown one went on the bottom. My intent was to put 4 jumper wires in here and watch one of them with the lab scope tomorrow morning. So those are the 4 wires. Insert this lock back in. Now we're going to put 4 jumpers in here. I noticed it while I was plugging these jumpers in. I was working outside the other day and I didn't notice that the terminals were quite loose, and I didn't spread them apart because I used a smaller terminal than what I'm using now. I used the plugging these in the order that they're, and then black is brown. This is a universal breakout harness, and green goes on top. Could be longer. One and two go on the top coil. 3 and 4 go on the bottom coil. I don't think that coil needs to be grounded, but I'm going to ground it anyways. I don't think it needs to be. Too bad these wires weren't long enough to reach. Maybe they are if I steal a little bit. Yeah. So we got the 4-channel lab scope hooked up to it. Channel 1 is connected to the ignition coil positive, and it's sitting at 11.97 volts. Channel 2, the green trace, is the ground on the coil. It's sitting at 0.015. Channel 3, the blue trace, is the control of number 1 and 2 ignition coil. That should be a 5 volt pulse. Why is that at 6.8 volts? And channel 3 is the red trace, which is the control of number 1 injector, and it's sitting at 11.9 volts because it's off right now and there's no ground. It's on the ground side. So let's see what it looks like when we run it. So the red trace is injector number 1, the blue trace is the ignition coil control on number 1 and 2. The yellow trace is the power supply to the coil, and the green trace is the ground. And I don't like that. Let's pause it, drop cursors on it. Of course, that could be normal. You can see the control side of the coil and what happens to the voltage. Well, it's not that low. Where the cursor is 10.3. And what's the ground doing? Oh, I need a cursor here. Oh my God. Fat fingers. The voltage on the ground is 0.1. Where cursor number 2 is 0.15. So it's not a problem, in my opinion. So we're gonna leave all this hooked up and put this car outside. Reconnect the scanner with or the lab scope with the 4 channels exactly like we have it, and see what we're missing tomorrow.
So I'm going to put a scanner and a scope on this thing this morning. It's minus 25. Got the 4-channel lab scope hooked up to see ignition firing events, injector firing events. What the hell? What the heck is that? Area select. Never asked me this yesterday. Maybe because I went into other diagnostics. I'm going to set this up. Okay, so we're going to try this thing. Got injector pulse width. No, it's not going to go. We've got to analyze this data. So here's the recording. You can see that we've got an ignition reference pulse to number 1 2 coil. That's the blue trace. We've got injector firing event, but the system voltage is so damn low under cranking event. It's like, let's drop cursors on here. Where cursor number 1 or number 2 is, the voltage to the ignition coil dropped to 6 volts. That's not enough. I mean, it is 25 below, but still it should make some attempt to fire. I'm going to try with a booster on it and see if it'll go with a boost. Well, I'm going to try with a boost on it. Let's pause this. So there it is with that booster battery hooked up to it. Drops to around 9 volts even with that. We got a bad ground on the engine or something. But still, we got injector pulse. We got ignition coil power. We got ignition coil signal. I'm going to check for spark now again. Okay, I'm going to check for spark now. I didn't hear any spark. Well, this car is eating my lunch. I got ignition coil control signal. I got injector pulse. Oh, I can hear the fuel pump running. But I got no spark. What's going on with this thing? This thing needs a priest. So analyzing this scope recording here, I see that the ground potential at the coil goes as high as 0.6 volts. And the voltage supplied to the coil is between 10 and 10 volts, and it drops down to around 8.6 volts, 8.7 volts. Ay. That's with the booster on it. I'm wondering if we have a bad ground on this engine. It does crank slow, but it is minus 25 for crying out loud. Well, I measured voltage drops on the engine ground, and it reads 0.2 cranking from the battery negative post to the engine block. And I've also measured to the body, and it reads 0.2 cranking. I swapped the ignition coil with the original coil. The customer informed me that that coil was replaced back in June, but that was prior to putting the engine in, and it is an aftermarket coil. All indications are that it's a defective coil. I mean, I appear to have a trigger signal into it, power to it, but yet it's got no spark. But again, why wouldn't a warm coil, if that's the problem, fix it? I was trying to take the fuel line off to qualify the injectors are delivering fuel. I got an injector pulse width signal both on the lab scope and on the scan tool, but I've got to figure out how to get this Houdini clip off of here. I can press in on it somehow. So after 20 minutes, half an hour in the shop, I'm going to burn this car. You would think that if it had been injecting fuel, it would have been rich. So I managed to get that fuel line off. There are two little release tabs that you have to use a 90-degree pick in here to release. Because they put this rib on here, you can't use a normal tool, it's too close. Subaru may have a special release tool, or maybe not. Check fuel pressure, although fuel pressure is not the issue in my opinion. It's got no freaking spark. I mean, I put a spark tester on it now that it runs, and it fires a spark tester, jumps 3/4 of an inch. Is there a possibility that we have a bad ground to that coil? It was going as high as 0.6, 0.7 volts. You're going to find out where those grounds are. Clean the grounds, because obviously when the system voltage is lower, everything is stressed even more, and it definitely drops to around 9-10 volts cranking cold. So I'm going to locate the grounds for these, and I'm going to clean all the grounds. I wish I had an OE coil to try on here, but I don't. So according to this Mitchell diagram, the ground for the coil is pin 3, and it's on the right side of the dash, GE2. And power comes from 38 on that diagram. 38 on this diagram. Wait a second, that's not right. Green, red, pin 2. I like how they number the coil. Terminals 1, 1, 4, 2, 3. Just to screw us up. Anyways, number 2 is power. Goes to location 38 on the previous schematic here. Location 38 here comes from a relay, the fuse relay block, ignition relay. And the power comes from that circuit, which is location 5 on the next diagram, which is this wire right here. Right fuse and relay box, 15 amp fuse. I'm going to clean some grounds, see if I find anything unusual. So I know these Subarus have ground straps on the engine, one on each frame rail. And you can see this one is rotted off. Now the shop that just put this engine in should have fixed that. I mean, you don't, they're there for a reason. Body grounds. There's one on this side, and it's rotted off as well. Now, why wouldn't you fix that when you did an engine R&R? I mean, I've commonly seen them like this, and it didn't appear to have any problem, but this ignition coil seems to be very sensitive to low voltage, and any voltage drops in the circuit could be causing it. Like right now, I went to start it to move it without the booster battery on it, and it cranked, it wouldn't start, and I checked, it had no spark. I hooked the booster battery up, and it sparked, and it started and ran. So I'm going to fix these grounds and clean this body ground here, and clean the engine grounds, charge the battery up, park it outside. So there's 2 new ground cables made out of some universal cable. This is stereo cable I salvaged from a vehicle. It's very fine, high current cable. And a couple of eyelets on each end, and heat shrunk and soldered. So we're going to clean up the mounting area. So there's the 2 grounds installed, cleaned up. We're going to clean the grounds on the engine block as well. I noticed the forward tranny cooler line leaking, so I put an extra hose clamp on it. I'll check the transmission fluid. This is transmission oil down here. Not serious, but we're in here now. Extra clamp. So the battery ground cable is mounted to this starter bracket. Cleaned that. There's 2 grounds up here at the front of the engine here. I've taken those off and cleaned them both. And we're gonna charge the battery for a few hours and put it outside and see what happens tomorrow. Well, I got all the grounds cleaned up. Now the engine is warm now. The battery's weak because of all this cranking. It's only at 12 volts open circuit. I'm gonna see what it does when I start it now. there's a positive cable at the starter. Now they've obviously had this off. Why wouldn't you clean it? I always tell the students, if you take a ring terminal off of anything for any reason, just clean it before you put it back on. So here we go again, take 13. Minus 26 Celsius. Been sitting all night. Where's the keys here? Well, I guess I can't blame the ground guys. I don't know what to do. I'm going to get a coil for this thing. So I managed to obtain a previously enjoyed genuine Subaru ignition coil from the salvage yard today. Sometimes a used part is more reliable than an OEM or an aftermarket part, I should say. So I've got 4 jumpers in there, and my thought is I'm going to park it outside again tonight. It's supposed to be like 28 to 30 below tonight. It started obviously this evening after being plugged in all day, just like nothing was wrong. I've also connected 4 jumper wires, the universal jumper harness in here. The red wire is power, the yellow wire is ground, and I've connected an alternate power source and ground that I can connect directly to the battery in case there's a voltage drop that I'm missing on the power side. And I'm going to start it and make sure it runs and park it outside and try it again tomorrow morning, take 14. Well, here we go again. Minus 27 this morning. Like a frozen popsicle. Where's the key? No interior light. Okay, I'm going to connect power and ground to that coil. I'll get a light here so I can see what I'm doing. The yellow wire is plus. The black wire is ground. Let's try it again. It's turning fast enough. Oh boy. Well, so much for that. What the hell is causing this problem? So this Subaru is killing me. So this afternoon I get home and I try to start it. It's warmed up to about minus 15 and it cranks with, and I confirm there's no spark. So I've got these 2 wires, these 2 jumper wires connected directly to the coil, power and ground, and I connected it right to the battery, power and ground, and I cranked it, still no spark. So then I connected these 2 wires to an auxiliary battery that I just took off a charger in the shop that's probably at about 13.5 volts, and I connected that directly to the coil, and I still got no spark, and it doesn't run. I connect the booster cables up to the car, and it cranks just a little bit faster, and it starts. Now I know I've got ignition coil control signals, I've got injector pulse. It seems like that coil is sensitive to RPM. So what I'm going to do is I picked up a reman starter. We're going to change out the starter this evening and see if that helps it crank a little faster, because it does feel a little bit lazy. I measured about 120 RPM cranking. Let's see if it'll actually, well, I'm not going to try it again. I'm I'm going to change out the starter and put it outside and try it again tomorrow. Take 55, I think we're up to, something like that. So there's the new starter installed. We're going to trickle charge the battery for a few hours. We're going to park it outside and see what happens tomorrow morning. Take number 35, I think. Well, we're going to try this thing one more time after putting a starter in it. Wow. Just cranking a little bit faster. It appears to be the answer. Oh my goodness sakes.